At dawn, when the body refuses to rise, Marcus Aurelius asked himself a single, brutal question. Was he born to feel warmth beneath blankets, or was he born to do the work only a human being can do?
Before the sun rises over the palace, a man who commands every legion in the known world lies still in the dark, and the only enemy he cannot defeat is his own bed. This is not the opening of a myth. This is a private page, never meant for anyone else's eyes, where the most powerful human being alive confesses a weakness so ordinary that every person watching this right now has felt the exact same paralysis. Not on a battlefield, not in a council chamber, in the quiet, suffocating moment of simply having to get up and continue. What he does next is not a speech. It is not a burst of willpower summoned from nowhere. It is a shift so small, so quiet, that almost no one notices its power until they try it themselves. He does not ask himself to feel motivated. He does not wait for inspiration to arrive like a gift from the gods. He does something far colder, far more effective, and far more disturbing to the modern mind, obsessed with feelings. He changes the question entirely. And once you understand the question he asked instead, you will never look at your own resistance the same way again. You have been taught your whole life to wait. Wait until you feel ready. Wait until the motivation arrives. Wait until the mood aligns with the task. This waiting has a name, though no one calls it by its true name. It is not patience. It is surrender, dressed as preparation. The emperor did not wait, not because he was made of different material than you, but because he refused to ask the question that keeps most people frozen in place. He never asked himself whether he felt like rising. He understood, with a clarity most humans spend a lifetime avoiding, that feeling has almost nothing to do with duty. A soldier does not check his enthusiasm before marching into formation. A physician does not consult her mood before entering the surgical room. Function does not bend to emotion. And yet somehow in the smallest moments of ordinary life, people convince themselves that emotion must arrive first before action is permitted. This is the trap. Not laziness, not weakness. A single misplaced question, repeated so often it becomes invisible. Am I motivated enough to do this? The moment that question takes root, defeat has already begun, because motivation is a mood, and moods are unreliable servants. They come uninvited and leave the same way. Building a life around their permission is building a house on water. The old Stoic masters understood something the modern world has forgotten in its obsession with inspiration and vision boards and morning rituals designed to manufacture a feeling. They understood that feeling is not the fuel. Function is the fuel. You are not a creature who must feel courageous to act courageously. You are a creature capable of acting first and allowing whatever feeling follows to follow on its own schedule, irrelevant to the outcome. This is the first quiet violence the emperor commits against his own resistance. He does not fight the feeling of not wanting to rise. He simply refuses to let that feeling cast a vote. And once you remove feeling from the position of authority, it never should have held. Something extraordinary happens to the war you have been fighting with yourself every single morning. But removing feeling from the throne is only the beginning. There is a colder, harder argument waiting beneath it, one drawn not from willpower at all, but from nature itself. And it is the argument that turned an exhausted man into an emperor who ruled for nearly 2 decades without ever once needing to feel like it. Nature does not ask permission before it moves. The vine does not pause to consider whether it feels inspired to climb. The bee does not weigh its emotions before returning to the hive with pollen on its legs. Water does not summon the will to fall from a cliff. It falls because falling is what water does when nothing obstructs it. This is the argument the emperor turned to next, colder than the first and far more difficult to argue against. He looked at his own resistance to rising and asked a question that strips away every excuse the mind manufactures in the dark. Was he brought into this world to feel warm beneath blankets, or was he brought into this world to do the work only a human being can do? The question sounds simple. It is not. It cuts directly through centuries of comfort seeking, straight to the bone of purpose. Every part of the natural order fulfills its function without protest. The fig tree produces figs. It does not resent the labor of photosynthesis. It does not request a day of rest from being a fig tree. Its entire existence is the fulfillment of what it is. And here stood a man gifted with reason, language, memory, and the capacity to shape entire civilizations, negotiating with himself over whether to leave a bed. This is where the argument turns uncomfortable, because it applies to you exactly as it applied to him. You were not placed in this life to produce the least possible friction for yourself. You were built with the capacity to think, to create, to protect, to endure. And every hour spent negotiating with comfort is an hour spent betraying the very architecture of what you are. The emperor did not see rising as an inconvenience imposed upon him. He saw it as the fulfillment of his nature, the same way warmth fulfills fire and flight fulfills the hawk. There is a particular cruelty in refusing your own function. Not the cruelty others inflict on you, but the quiet cruelty of watching your own days pass in avoidance, knowing somewhere beneath the surface that you were capable of more and chose the blanket instead. The emperor refused to be that kind of man, not through dramatic declarations, but through this single cold recalibration repeated every single morning of his reign. Yet knowing your function is not the same as living it without resistance. Even nature, when examined closely, still requires a second layer of understanding, one that explains why the mind keeps arguing long after the body has already agreed to move. And that layer begins with a question most people never think to ask about their own suffering. Pain arrives without asking your opinion. A cold morning, a body that resists, a mind heavy with everything left undone. This is the first wound, and it requires no permission to exist. But there is a second wound, one you construct entirely by yourself, and this second wound often hurts far more than the first ever could. The Stoics called it adding opinion to injury. The body aches, and that is simply data, a fact of physical existence. But then the mind arrives with commentary. This is unbearable. This should not be happening to me. Why must I suffer this when others seem to suffer less? None of these thoughts change the original discomfort by a single degree. All they do is multiply it, layering resentment on top of sensation, until a minor inconvenience becomes, in the theater of the mind, an unbearable catastrophe. The emperor understood this doubling with painful precision because he lived inside a body that betrayed him constantly. Chronic illness followed him through most of his adult life. Stomach pain, breathing difficulty, exhaustion that never fully lifted. He did not have the luxury of waiting for a pain-free morning to practice discipline. If he had required comfort as a prerequisite for duty, Rome would have collapsed decades before his reign ended. So he trained himself in a distinction most people never learn to make. There is the event, and there is the story told about the event. The cold sheets are the event. The story is the endless internal monologue insisting this feeling means something has gone wrong, that comfort is owed, that struggle is unfair. Strip away the story, and what remains is remarkably survivable. A body that aches, a mind that resists. Neither of these facts requires collapse. Collapse only enters through the second wound, the one manufactured entirely by interpretation. This is not a call to suppress feeling or pretend discomfort does not exist. It is something far more precise. It is the recognition that suffering has two authors, and only one of them is beyond your control. The world writes the first sentence. You write every sentence after it. Most people hand the pen to their most panicked, most catastrophizing inner voice, and then wonder why the page fills with despair. Once this distinction becomes visible, something shifts permanently in how resistance feels. The discomfort of rising, of working, of continuing, stops being an emergency and becomes simply weather, present but not decisive. And this shift in perception opens the door to an even more dangerous discovery. The moment you realize that the very comfort you keep chasing might be the true enemy disguised as a friend. There is a particular danger in comfort, one the mind is remarkably skilled at hiding from itself. Comfort feels like safety. It feels like relief. It presents itself as the reasonable choice, the gentle choice, the choice a wise person would make when tired. And yet, comfort, chosen again and again in the exact moments discipline is required, becomes something closer to sabotage wearing a friendly face. Consider what actually happens in the instant resistance rises. The body wants to stay still. The mind produces a wave of relief at the thought of staying still. That relief feels good, immediately, chemically, undeniably. But relief is not the same as benefit. A moment of ease bought at the price of a larger purpose is not peace. It is a loan taken out against your own future, and loans of this kind always carry interest. The emperor understood that the mind will always advocate for the path of least resistance, because the mind left unchecked optimizes for the next 5 minutes rather than the next 5 years. This is not a flaw unique to weak character. It is simply how untrained attention behaves. Given a choice between immediate ease and long-term integrity, the untrained mind chooses ease almost every time, then invents a justification afterward to make the choice sound rational. He refused to let this mechanism run unquestioned. Each time the pull toward comfort appeared, he treated it not as a neutral impulse but as a claim that required evidence. Is this rest, or is this avoidance wearing the mask of rest? Is this a genuine need of the body, or a bribe offered by a mind that wants to avoid the discomfort of duty? The distinction matters enormously because true rest restores you for the work ahead, while avoidance only postpones the same resistance to tomorrow, slightly heavier than it was today. This is the trap most people fall into without ever noticing the mechanism at work. They believe they are choosing peace when they choose to stay in bed, to delay the difficult conversation, to avoid the task that matters most. But peace does not usually feel like relief in the moment. Peace is often found on the other side of the very discomfort being avoided. What feels like peace in the instant of avoidance is frequently just the anesthetic of procrastination, wearing peace as a disguise. The emperor's method was not to fight comfort with brute force. It was to interrogate it calmly every single time it appeared, refusing to grant it authority, simply because it arrived wrapped in the language of relief. This habit of interrogation, repeated daily, is what separates discipline from suffering. But even this recognition is not enough on its own, because ideas tested only in comfortable rooms rarely survive contact with real catastrophe. And what happened next in his life would test every one of these ideas against forces far larger than a reluctant mourning. Philosophy spoken from comfort is easy to admire and easy to forget. Philosophy tested by catastrophe becomes something else entirely. It becomes proof, and the years that followed gave the emperor more proof than any philosopher could ever wish upon himself. A plague swept through the empire during his reign, one of the most devastating outbreaks the ancient world had recorded, killing soldiers, senators, and common citizens without distinction. Entire legions were weakened by illness at the exact moment the borders required their strength. This was not an abstract meditation on mortality written in a quiet study. This was mortality arriving daily, in numbers, in names, in the faces of men he had commanded personally. At the same time, hostile tribes pressed against the northern frontier, forcing him to leave the comforts of Rome and govern from military camps for years at a stretch. No marble halls, no attendants managing every discomfort, just cold tents, campaign logistics, and the exhausting daily labor of holding a crumbling frontier together while illness spread through his own ranks. If there was ever a reasonable moment to abandon a philosophy of discipline in favor of despair, this was it. Disease on one side, war on the other. A body already weakened by chronic illness, forced to function at the edge of collapse for years without meaningful relief. And yet the private writings from this exact period contain no plea for pity, no collapse into self-focused suffering. They contain the same cold function-first reasoning explored in the previous chapters, now applied under conditions almost no modern person will ever have to face. This is what separates a philosophy that merely sounds impressive from a philosophy capable of holding weight. Ideas about discipline are cheap when tested only against a warm bed and a mild inconvenience. They become extraordinary when tested against plague, war, and a body in constant pain, and still hold their shape. The emperor did not develop this method in theory and hope it would survive contact with real hardship. He developed it inside the hardship itself, refined by necessity, because there was no other option available to him. This context changes how every previous chapter should be understood. The removal of feeling as the deciding authority, the focus on function over comfort, the refusal to add a second wound through complaint, none of this was philosophy performed for an audience. It was survival architecture, built out of raw necessity by a man who had no space left for illusions about how the world owed him ease. But even a method proven under war and disease can be shattered by a different kind of wound entirely, one that comes not from nature or illness, but from another human being he trusted completely. And what happened next tested every principle discussed so far against something far harder to forgive than exhaustion. Somewhere in the eastern provinces, a general he had trusted with real authority, a man who had served him competently for years, declared himself emperor. A false rumor claimed the emperor had died, and instead of waiting for confirmation, this trusted commander moved immediately to seize power for himself. It was not a stranger's betrayal. It was not an enemy at the border acting according to expected hostility. It was a man who had eaten at his table, who had been given command because he was believed loyal, turning against him the moment opportunity appeared. Betrayal of this kind cuts differently than any external hardship. Plague can be blamed on nature. War can be blamed on hostile tribes acting according to their own interests. But betrayal by someone chosen, someone trusted, forces a harder question inward. What did I fail to see? What signal did I miss? This is the kind of wound that tempts even disciplined minds toward bitterness, toward a permanent narrowing of trust, toward the quiet decision to never again extend faith to anyone. The response recorded from this period is almost unsettling in its restraint. There is no fury demanding excessive punishment. There is instead a kind of sorrowful clarity, an acknowledgement that people will sometimes act against you, that betrayal is woven into the fabric of dealing with other human beings, and that reacting with matching cruelty only multiplies damage rather than repairing it. When the rebellion collapsed on its own, undone by men within the traitor's own camp, there was no celebration of vengeance achieved. There was instead an expressed wish that the man might have been spared the chance to explain himself, rather than killed before reconciliation was possible. This response reveals something the previous chapters only hinted at. Discipline is not simply the ability to rise from a bed or push through physical discomfort. Discipline extends into the hardest territory of all, the ability to hold your principles intact, even when another person's cruelty gives you every justification to abandon them. It would have been easy, understandable even, to respond to betrayal with matching betrayal, to let one man's disloyalty become permission for a general collapse into suspicion and vengeance. That collapse never came. This is the deeper cost of discipline that most people never discuss. It is not only about doing hard things, it is about refusing to let other people's failures become the excuse for your own moral unraveling. The general's betrayal was his choice. How the emperor responded to it remained entirely his own, uncontaminated by the smaller person who had wronged him. And this brings the method to its sharpest edge yet, because everything examined so far has dealt with resistance rising from within, from exhaustion, from pain, from the pull toward comfort. Betrayal introduces resistance from outside, delivered by another person entirely. Yet the response required turns out to be built from the exact same foundation already laid, one that becomes even clearer in the practice explored next, a private ritual performed at the close of every single day. Discipline that only exists in the heat of the moment rarely survives the accumulation of small failures over time. This is why the emperor built a second practice into his days, one that had nothing to do with rising in the morning and everything to do with what happened after the sun had already set. Each night, before sleep, he returned to the events of the day in his mind, not to punish himself and not to flatter himself either. He simply looked. Where did resistance win? Where did comfort take the argument by default without ever being questioned? Where did irritation slip past attention and shape a word or an action that fell short of the standard he had set for himself? This was not a search for guilt. Guilt paralyzes. This was a search for information, the same way a commander reviews a battle not to feel shame over losses, but to understand exactly where the line broke. Most people avoid this kind of review entirely, because it requires a willingness to see clearly without immediately collapsing into either denial or self-punishment. The mind prefers one of two comfortable lies. Either everything today was fine, no examination needed, or everything today was a disaster, proof of permanent inadequacy. Both of these responses avoid the actual work. Both allow the same pattern to repeat tomorrow, unchanged, because neither one produces useful information. The Emperor's private review sat in the narrow, uncomfortable space between these two lies. It demanded specificity, not a vague feeling of having done poorly, but a precise accounting. This moment, this reaction, this small surrender to comfort when duty required something else. And once named with this kind of precision, a failure stops being a source of shame and becomes instead a target for tomorrow's attention. This nightly practice explains something crucial about how discipline actually compounds over time. It is not built through occasional bursts of extraordinary willpower during dramatic moments. It is built through this quiet, repeated act of honest accounting, night after night, each small correction accumulating into a character that no longer requires dramatic effort to hold its shape. The soldier does not become disciplined through one impressive battle. The soldier becomes disciplined through years of small corrections, absorbed so completely that the correct response eventually requires no deliberation at all. This is also where the difference between performance and character becomes impossible to hide. A person who behaves well only when observed has built nothing durable, because the moment observation disappears, so does the discipline. The Emperor's nightly review existed precisely because no one else would ever see it. There was no audience for this private ledger, no public credit to be gained from reviewing his own failures in the dark. And this absence of an audience turns out to be the exact place where real character is either built or quietly abandoned, a distinction the next chapter examines directly. There is a version of you that exists only when someone else is watching, and there is a version of you that exists when the room is completely empty. Most people spend their entire lives investing in the first version, polishing behavior for an audience, while quietly neglecting the second. The Emperor understood that only one of these versions is real, and it is never the one performing for witnesses. Think about how differently effort feels when observation disappears. A task completed thoroughly because someone might check the work is not the same as a task completed thoroughly because thoroughness is simply who you are. The first depends entirely on the possibility of being seen. Remove the observer, and the standard collapses along with them. The second requires no observer at all, because the standard was never borrowed from outside eyes in the first place. This distinction mattered enormously to a man whose entire life was, in theory, under constant observation. Emperors are watched by senators, by soldiers, by servants, by historians already composing the record of his reign before he had finished living it. And yet the private writings reveal a man far more concerned with the moments no one else would ever witness. Not the ceremonies, not the public displays of leadership, but the quiet, unrecorded choices made alone, in a tent, in the dark, in a moment of exhaustion where no consequence would follow from simply letting the standard slip. This is where discipline reveals its true nature. Anyone can maintain composure during a public trial of character because public failure carries a cost that private failure does not. The true test arrives in the moment no cost exists at all. No one will know if the work was rushed instead of done properly. No one will know if the difficult conversation was avoided instead of confronted. No one will know if the private thought was allowed to curdle into resentment instead of being examined and released. In these unwitnessed moments, character either holds its shape or reveals that it was never solid to begin with. The Emperor treated these private moments as the real examination, far more significant than any public performance. He operated as though an unseen witness were always present, not out of superstition, but as a discipline of the mind, a refusal to let the absence of an audience become permission for a lesser standard. This habit did something remarkable over time. It made his public behavior an honest reflection of his private behavior, rather than a performance covering for private neglect. This principle exposes an uncomfortable question for anyone willing to sit with it honestly. Who are you when no one is checking? That answer, more than any public achievement, more than any title or position, is the truest measure of the discipline actually being built. And this question becomes even sharper when every external support finally disappears entirely. A moment explored next when logic, duty, and example all reach their limit at once. There comes a point where logic runs out of ground to stand on. The argument from nature, the appeal to function, the discipline of nightly review, all of these tools are powerful, but they are still tools of the mind, and there are moments in life when the mind itself has been worn down past the point where any argument feels convincing. Illness deepens. Grief arrives without warning. Exhaustion accumulates past the threshold where clever reasoning can reach it. What happens then? What is left when even philosophy goes quiet? This question matters because it is the question almost no one prepares for. People build entire systems of discipline around good arguments, useful habits, motivating ideas, and these systems function beautifully right up until the moment life delivers something too heavy for argument to lift. A parent buried, a body that no longer responds the way it once did. A failure so complete that no reframe seems to touch it. In these moments, the elegant reasoning explored so far can feel distant, almost insulting in its calm. The emperor faced exactly this kind of exhaustion repeatedly throughout his reign, and what remains in his private writings during these darkest stretches is not a triumphant solution. It is something quieter and in its own way more honest. When logic fails to move you, movement itself becomes the argument. Not because you have been persuaded, not because comfort has been convincingly reframed as unimportant, but because the body can still act even when the mind has stopped believing the reasons for acting. This is a subtle shift from everything discussed before. Earlier chapters focused on changing the question, reframing pain, refusing comfort's false authority. This final layer requires none of that. It requires only the smallest possible motion forward, performed without waiting for conviction to arrive first. Rise, even though rising feels meaningless in this particular hour. Speak the necessary word, even though the will behind it feels hollow. Complete the smallest fragment of duty, not because it has been reasoned into significance, but simply because it is the next available action. And the next available action is always, in the end, still available. This is the last resort discipline offers, when every elevated argument has been exhausted, and it turns out to be enough more often than people expect. Motion creates its own momentum. A single action performed without full belief often reopens the door that belief itself could not force open. The emperor did not always feel the truth of his own philosophy in these darkest hours. He simply continued acting as though it were true, and continuation became the bridge back to conviction, rather than the other way around. This is the quiet secret hidden beneath everything explored so far. Discipline was never actually built on feeling ready. It was built on the willingness to act without readiness, chapter after chapter, day after day, until the very question of feeling ready stopped mattering at all. And once this final layer is understood, everything examined so far collapses into a single, unavoidable conclusion about what discipline actually was the entire time. An empire, at its height, could buy almost anything. Marble palaces, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, the loyalty of senators, the silence of enemies, the comfort of every possible convenience a human being could request. And yet the one thing that empire could never purchase was the will to rise on a morning when rising felt pointless. No treasury holds that currency. No legion can conquer that particular battlefield on your behalf. It has to be fought alone, in silence, without applause. Every single day, the option to stay still presents itself as the easier choice. This is the truth sitting beneath everything examined in this video. The emperor was not disciplined because he possessed some rare gift unavailable to ordinary people. He was disciplined because he refused, again and again, to let feeling occupy the seat that only function was meant to hold. He questioned the story his mind told about discomfort. He recognized comfort as a bribe disguised as peace. He carried the weight of plague, war, and betrayal without letting any of it become permission for collapse. He reviewed himself honestly each night, not to punish but to correct. He behaved the same way whether watched or completely alone. And when even that foundation grew thin under the weight of exhaustion, he acted anyway, allowing motion itself to carry him forward until belief returned on its own schedule. None of this required a perfect mood, None of this required the absence of doubt. What it required was a decision repeated daily to act in accordance with duty, regardless of how the morning felt. This is the actual trick hidden inside everything explored today. There was no secret formula, no hidden shortcut, no motivational phrase capable of dissolving resistance permanently. There was only the refusal to wait for permission that feelings were never going to grant. You are standing exactly where he stood, every single morning, whether you carry the weight of an empire or simply the weight of your own unfinished life. The bed feels heavier some days than others. The reasons to stay still will always sound reasonable in the moment they arrive. But function does not require your enthusiasm to remain valid. Duty does not evaporate because inspiration failed to show up on schedule. Finally, understand this. The moment you stop asking whether you feel ready and simply move is the exact moment discipline stops being a struggle and becomes instead the quiet architecture of who you actually are.